Hello there, and welcome to a peaceful journey through time. Tonight we're going to drift back thousands of years to explore the gentle mysteries of ancient civilizations. These are stories of people who lived, loved, and built magnificent worlds long before our modern age. Their daily lives, their quiet rituals, and their remarkable achievements hold a special kind of wonder. Something soothing about the way they moved through their days with patience and purpose. We'll wander through forgotten cities where time moved differently, where the rhythm of life followed the sun and seasons rather than clocks and deadlines. These ancient peoples understood something we often forget, that there is beauty in simplicity, wisdom in tradition, and peace in living close to the natural world. Their stories carry a calming quality that can help settle our restless modern minds. If you enjoy these gentle explorations of history, feel free to like and subscribe, or simply share your thoughts down in the comments. It helps others find their way to these peaceful moments too. But for now, let your breathing slow and your thoughts soften as we step quietly into the past. Let these ancient voices whisper their secrets across the centuries. And if you're ready, let's begin our journey to civilizations lost in time. The people of ancient Mesopotamia invented the world's first cities, but they did so with remarkable gentleness toward their environment. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they created settlements that worked in harmony with the flooding patterns of the water. They didn't fight against nature. Instead, they learned its rhythms and built their lives around them. When the rivers swelled with spring rains, the Mesopotamians welcomed the water into carefully designed canals that carried life to their crops. Their cities rose slowly from the fertile mud, brick by brick, generation by generation. The people who built Ur and Babylon understood that great things take time. They laid foundations that would last for millennia, not because they hurried, but because they took care with each step. The ziggurats that dominated their skylines weren't built in a single season. They grew over decades as each community added another level, another layer of devotion to their gods and their future. In these ancient cities, the day began before dawn with the soft sound of grinding grain. Women would wake early to prepare the day's bread, working the stone querns in a rhythm passed down through countless generations. The sound was almost musical, a gentle percussion that marked the beginning of another day. Children would wake to this familiar sound, knowing that breakfast and warmth awaited them. The Mesopotamians developed the first known schools, but learning happened at a pace that honored the natural development of the mind. Students would spend years mastering the art of writing on clay tablets, their small fingers learning to press cuneiform symbols into the soft earth. There was no rushing this process. Each symbol had to be perfect, each word carefully formed. The teachers understood that knowledge, like a good harvest, requires patience to grow properly. Their legal system, recorded in the famous Code of Hammurabi, reveals a society that valued fairness and order above all else. These weren't harsh laws designed to punish, but careful guidelines meant to help people live together in peace. The code covered everything from trade disputes to family matters, always seeking balance rather than vengeance. It shows us a civilization that believed in second chances and redemption. Along the Nile River, the ancient Egyptians created a culture so stable it lasted for over 3,000 years. This wasn't accomplished through force or rapid change, but through a deep understanding of consistency and renewal. The Egyptians watched the river flood every year at exactly the same time, bringing rich soil to their fields. They learned that reliability creates abundance, and they built their entire civilization on this principle. The construction of the pyramids represents perhaps the most peaceful, massive undertaking in human history. These monuments weren't built by slaves driven by whips, as popular imagination suggests. Recent archaeological evidence shows they were constructed by well-fed, well-cared-for workers who took pride in their contribution to eternity. The pyramids rose stone by stone, with each block carefully cut, transported, and placed with mathematical precision. Egyptian workers followed a seasonal rhythm that respected both human needs and natural cycles. During the flood season, when farm work was impossible, thousands of people would come to work on the pyramids. They lived in purpose-built villages with bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities. They weren't forced laborers, but participants in a great communal project that would outlast them all. The process of mummification reveals the Egyptian approach to time itself. They believed that rushing would damage the soul's journey to the afterlife, so they developed a 70-day process that could not be hurried. Each step had its proper time and season. The body was carefully prepared, wrapped in linen, blessed by priests, and surrounded by objects that would provide comfort in the next world. This wasn't morbid obsession with death, but a gentle preparation for the continuation of life in another form. Egyptian medicine was remarkably advanced, but it emphasized prevention and gentle healing over dramatic intervention. Physicians spent years learning not just anatomy and surgery, but also the proper herbs, prayers, and rituals that would help the whole person heal. They understood that the body, mind, and spirit were connected, and true healing required attention to all three. In the Indus Valley, a civilization flourished that may have been the most peaceful in human history. The cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro show no evidence of warfare, no weapons of mass destruction, no fortified walls built for defense. Instead, they reveal a society that invested its energy in public works that benefited everyone equally. Every house had access to a sophisticated sewage system. Every neighborhood had public baths and granaries. The Indus Valley people were master craftsmen who created beautiful objects with infinite patience. Their pottery was perfectly symmetrical, decorated with intricate patterns that required hours of careful work. Their bronze figures show an understanding of human anatomy that could only come from long observation and practice. They made jewelry so delicate that modern techniques can barely replicate it. Each piece was a meditation in metal and stone. Their cities were planned with a precision that speaks to decades of thoughtful development. Streets ran in perfect grids with wider boulevards for traffic and narrower lanes for pedestrians. The drainage system was so well designed that it continued to function effectively for over 1,000 years. This wasn't accomplished through rushed construction or shortcuts, but through careful planning and meticulous execution. The Indus Valley civilization appears to have been remarkably egalitarian. Archaeologists find no evidence of royal palaces or monuments to individual rulers. Instead, the wealth of the society seems to have been shared relatively equally. Houses vary in size, but all have access to the same public amenities. This suggests a culture that valued community welfare over individual aggrandizement. Trade was central to Indus Valley life, but it was conducted with a gentleness that built lasting relationships rather than quick profits. Their merchants traveled as far as Mesopotamia and Central Asia, carrying beautiful crafts and bringing back precious materials. They established trading posts that lasted for generations, building networks of trust and mutual benefit that spanned continents. In ancient China, the philosophy of harmony between humanity and nature shaped every aspect of daily life. The Chinese developed the concept of feng shui, the art of living in balance with the natural forces that surround us. They observed how water flows around obstacles rather than fighting them, how trees bend in the wind rather than breaking, how mountains endure by accepting change slowly over time. Chinese cities were designed as mirrors of the cosmos, with the emperor's palace at the center representing the North Star around which all else revolves. But this wasn't about domination, it was about finding one's proper place in the larger order of things. Citizens could find peace by understanding their role in the grand design, whether they were farmers, craftsmen, scholars, or merchants. The Great Wall of China represents not aggression, but patient defense. It was built over centuries by millions of workers who understood they were creating something that would protect their descendants. Each stone was placed with the knowledge that this wall would stand long after the builders were gone. The construction followed the natural contours of the landscape, working with the mountains and valleys rather than against them. Chinese medicine developed over thousands of years through careful observation of how the body responds to different treatments. Practitioners spent decades learning to feel the subtle variations in a patient's pulse that would reveal imbalances in their system. They understood that healing happens gradually and the best treatments work with the body's natural tendency toward health rather than forcing rapid change. The ancient Chinese invented paper, gunpowder, and the compass, but they introduced these innovations slowly, allowing society time to adapt. They understood that technology should serve human needs rather than disrupting the social order. New inventions were tested carefully, refined over generations, and integrated into daily life only when they had proven their worth. Tea ceremony in ancient China was a meditation on the present moment. The ritual of preparing and sharing tea required participants to slow down, to pay attention to the water temperature, the steeping time, the flavor and aroma of each cup. It was a practice that brought people together in peaceful contemplation, a reminder that the simple act of sharing a drink could become a doorway to deeper understanding. These ancient civilizations understood something we often forget in our hurried modern world: that the most meaningful achievements require patience, that the strongest foundations are built slowly, and that true progress happens when people work together over generations toward a common goal. Their stories remind us that there is wisdom in taking time, beauty in tradition, and strength in gentle persistence. As we continue our journey through these peaceful ancient worlds, we'll discover more about how these remarkable people lived, loved, and created lasting beauty in their daily lives. Their gentle wisdom echoes across the centuries, offering us glimpses of different ways to be human, different rhythms of life, and different definitions of what it means to build something that will endure. Ancient Greece gave birth to democracy, but their approach to governance was surprisingly gentle and deliberative. In the Agora of Athens, citizens would gather not to shout or argue, but to listen carefully to different viewpoints before making decisions that would affect their community. They understood that wisdom emerges from patient discussion rather than hasty judgment. The marble columns that surrounded these meeting places weren't just architectural features. They were symbols of the strength that comes from people standing together in support of shared ideals. Greek philosophers spent their days walking slowly groves and through olived along peaceful coastlines, developing ideas that would guide human thinking for millennia. Socrates taught his students not through lectures, but through gentle questioning that helped them discover truth within themselves. He would spend entire afternoons with a single student, asking questions that gradually revealed the deeper principles underlying their beliefs. This wasn't about winning arguments, but about nurturing understanding. The Olympic Games began as a celebration of human potential achieved through years of patient training. Athletes would prepare for these competitions not through brutal regimens, but through balanced development of body, mind, and spirit. They understood that peak performance comes from harmony rather than force. During the Games, all warfare ceased across the Greek world. For a brief time, competition replaced conflict, and excellence was celebrated rather than power. Greek artisans carved marble with the same meditative focus their philosophers brought to ideas. They would spend months on a single statue, gradually revealing the figure they believed already existed within the stone. Each chisel mark was deliberate, each curve carefully considered. They weren't in a hurry to finish, but sought to capture something eternal in their work. The statues that survive today still emanate the calm patience of their creators. The Greek concept of hospitality, known as xenia, required hosts to welcome strangers without even asking their names first. This sacred duty meant providing food, shelter, and protection to travelers who might bring news from distant lands or wisdom from other cultures. It was a practice that built bridges between communities and created networks of trust that spanned the Mediterranean world. In their homes, Greeks would gather each evening for symposiums, peaceful meetings where friends shared wine, food, and philosophical discussions. These weren't parties, but thoughtful exchanges where participants explored questions about virtue, beauty, and the good life. They would recline on couches, speaking in turn, listening carefully to each other's insights. The goal wasn't to prove anyone wrong, but to collectively approach truth. The island civilization of Crete developed a culture that seems to have been remarkably peaceful for over 1,000 years. The Minoans built palaces without defensive walls, suggesting they lived without fear of attack. Their art depicts dolphins playing in blue seas, women gathering flowers in mountain meadows, and people participating in ritual games that celebrated life rather than commemorating war. Minoan craftsmen created pottery so delicate it seems to capture the movement of ocean waves. Their frescoes show a society that valued grace and beauty above military might. Women appear to have held positions of authority, presiding over religious ceremonies and participating fully in public life. The famous snake goddess figurines suggest a culture that saw divinity in nature and found spiritual meaning in the cycles of growth and renewal. The Minoans developed an intricate system of roads that connected their cities not for military purposes, but for trade and cultural exchange. They built these pathways to follow the natural contours of their mountainous islands, creating routes that were both practical and beautiful. Travelers could journey from one end of Crete to another while enjoying views of terraced hillsides planted with olive trees and grapevines. Their palaces were designed as centers of community life rather than fortresses for rulers. The Palace of Knossos featured elaborate drainage systems, multiple stories connected by grand staircases, and rooms decorated with colorful frescoes that celebrated the natural world. Light wells brought sunshine deep into the interior spaces, creating an environment that felt open and welcoming rather than enclosed and defensive. Celtic societies across Europe developed a deep spiritual connection to the landscapes they inhabited. They saw sacred meaning in groves of oak trees, in springs that bubbled up from underground sources, and in stone circles that aligned with the movements of stars and seasons. Their druids spent 20 years memorizing the oral traditions that preserved their people's wisdom, understanding that some knowledge was too precious to risk losing through hasty transcription. Celtic metalworkers created objects of stunning intricacy, weaving patterns that seemed to flow like water or wind through their jewelry, weapons, and household items. Each piece required months of careful work, with artisans developing their skills over decades of patient practice. They believed that the spiral patterns they carved held spiritual power, connecting the physical world to unseen realms of meaning and mystery. In Celtic communities, bards held positions of great respect, traveling from settlement to share stories that preserved historical memory and moral guidance. These weren't simple entertainers, but keepers of cultural wisdom who could recite genealogies stretching back dozens of generations. They understood that stories shape how people see themselves and their place in the world, and they took this responsibility seriously. Celtic festivals marked the changing seasons with rituals that brought communities together in celebration of renewal and continuity. Samhain honored the ancestors and the approaching winter, while Beltane welcomed spring with fires that symbolized the return of life to the land. These celebrations weren't hurried affairs, but extended gatherings that allowed people to reconnect with each other and with the natural cycles that governed their lives. The Celts practiced a form of justice that emphasized restoration rather than punishment. When someone committed a crime, the community would gather to determine how the harm could be repaired and the offender reintegrated into society. This process could take days or weeks, but they understood that true justice requires patience and the participation of everyone affected by wrongdoing. Ancient Persian civilization developed a remarkable tradition of religious tolerance that allowed diverse peoples to maintain their own beliefs and customs while participating in a larger imperial framework. Cyrus the Great issued what many consider the first charter of human rights, declaring that all people should be free to worship according to their conscience and live according to their traditions. Persian gardens were designed as earthly representations of paradise, with flowing water, fragrant flowers, and shaded walkways that provided peaceful retreat from the heat and dust of daily life. These weren't just decorative spaces, but spiritual environments where people could contemplate the beauty of creation and find inner peace. The Persian word for paradise, paradisa, originally meant a walled garden, suggesting that they saw paradise not as a distant realm, but as something that could be created here on earth through careful attention to beauty and harmony. The Persian postal system, known as the Royal Road, connected distant parts of their empire not through military conquest but through efficient communication. Mounted messengers could carry news and letters across thousands of miles, enabling merchants, scholars, and families to maintain connections across vast distances. This network fostered trade and cultural exchange that enriched all the peoples it touched. Persian poetry developed a tradition of mystical verse that explored themes of divine love and spiritual longing. Poets like Rumi and Hafez wrote lines that continue to inspire readers centuries later, finding in human experience reflections of cosmic truths. Their work wasn't created quickly, but evolved through years of contemplation and refinement. as these poets sought words that could capture the ineffable experiences of the soul. In Persia, the art of carpet weaving became a meditation on patience and perfection. Master weavers would spend years creating a single carpet, tying thousands of individual knots according to patterns passed down through generations. Each carpet told a story through its colors and designs, preserving cultural memory in thread and dye. The process required such concentration and skill that it became a form of spiritual practice, connecting the weaver to a tradition stretching back centuries. These ancient civilizations remind us that human greatness doesn't always announce itself with fanfare or speed. Sometimes the most profound achievements emerge from quiet persistence, from communities working together across generations, from individuals who understood that the most beautiful creations require time to develop properly. Their gentle approaches to life offer us alternative models for how to build, how to govern, how to create, and how to find meaning in the everyday rhythms of existence. As we drift deeper into these ancient worlds, we discover that the pace of life itself was different then. People measured progress not in quarterly reports, but in seasons and generations. They understood that the most important things, love, wisdom, community, and spiritual understanding, cannot be rushed, but must be cultivated with the same patience a gardener brings to tending growing things. In the mountains of ancient Peru, the Inca developed a civilization that worked in perfect harmony with some of the world's most challenging terrain. Rather than fighting against the steep slopes and thin air of the Andes, they learned to embrace these conditions and turn them into advantages. Their agricultural terraces stepped gracefully down mountainsides like giant staircases, creating fertile, growing spaces where none should have existed. Each terrace was built stone by stone without mortar, yet fitted so precisely that not even a knife blade could slip between the blocks. The Inca understood that building in the mountains required a different kind of patience. They couldn't rush the process of moving massive stones up impossible slopes. Instead, they developed techniques that used gravity and leverage rather than brute force. Teams of workers would spend months carefully shaping each stone, testing its fit, adjusting and refining until it settled perfectly into place. The result was architecture that has withstood centuries of earthquakes that would topple modern buildings. Their road system, stretching over 25,000 miles through some of the world's most difficult terrain, was built with the same methodical care. These weren't straight highways bulldozed through obstacles, but pathways that followed the natural contours of the landscape. Inca engineers would study a mountainside for months before deciding where to place each section of road, ensuring that the path would be stable for generations to come. Machu Picchu, their most famous city, demonstrates the Inca approach to living within nature rather than dominating it. The city was built around existing rock formations, incorporating natural features into the architecture. Sacred stones were left untouched, becoming focal points for temples and ceremonies. Water was channeled through the city using gravity-fed systems that still function perfectly today. The entire complex feels like it grew from the mountain itself rather than being imposed upon it. Inca society was organized around the concept of aini, reciprocal cooperation that ensured everyone's needs were met. Community members would work together on each other's projects, understanding that individual success depended on collective well-being. During harvest time, entire villages would move from field to field, helping each family gather their crops. No one was expected to manage alone, and no one's contribution was considered too small to matter. Their system of record-keeping used quipu, intricate arrangements of knotted strings that could preserve complex information without written language. Creating a quipu required deep concentration and mathematical understanding, as different types of knots, colors, and positions all carried specific meanings. Master quipu makers spent years learning this art, developing the ability to encode everything from census data to historical narratives in arrangements of colored cord. In ancient Japan, the Shinto tradition taught that divine spirits inhabited natural features like mountains, rivers, and ancient trees. This belief shaped a culture that moved gently through the landscape, taking only what was needed and giving thanks for every gift received. Japanese craftsmen developed techniques for working with wood that honored the natural grain and character of each piece, creating buildings that seemed to breathe with life. The Japanese tea ceremony evolved into a meditation on the beauty found in simple, careful actions. Participants would spend hours learning the precise movements required to prepare and serve tea, understanding that each gesture carried meaning. The ceremony wasn't about the beverage itself, but about creating a shared moment of tranquility where people could escape the rushing world and find peace in deliberate, mindful activity. Gardens were designed as 3 Japanese dimensional poems that change with the seasons and the viewer's perspective. Garden makers would spend years studying how light fell across different areas throughout the day, how water would flow during various weather conditions, how plants would look in spring bloom and autumn color. They understood that a garden was never truly finished, but continued to evolve as living elements grew and changed over time. The practice of origami transformed simple paper into complex sculptures through patient folding and refolding. Masters of this art could create incredibly detailed figures using nothing but precise creases and folds, never cutting or gluing the paper. Each fold had to be perfect, as mistakes couldn't be undone without starting over completely. The discipline required developed both technical skill and spiritual patience. In ancient Scandinavia, Norse societies developed during long winter months when outdoor work was impossible. They used these quiet seasons for crafting, storytelling, and planning, the activities that would resume when spring returned. Their longships were works of art as well as transportation, with each curve of the hull carefully shaped to move efficiently through northern waters. Building a single ship could take an entire winter, with skilled craftsmen working by firelight to create vessels that would carry their families safely across dangerous seas. Norse storytelling traditions preserved cultural wisdom through sagas that were memorized and passed down through generations. These weren't simple entertainment, but complex narratives that explored themes of honor, courage, and the proper way to face life's inevitable challenges. Skilled storytellers could recite for hours without repeating themselves, drawing listeners into worlds where heroes faced impossible odds with dignity and determination. The Norse developed a sophisticated understanding of seasonal cycles, celebrating the return of light during the darkest time of year with festivals that brought communities together. They understood that hope must be deliberately cultivated during difficult periods, that people need rituals and celebrations to sustain them through hardship. Their festivals weren't hurried affairs, but extended gatherings that strengthened social bonds and renewed spiritual connections. Viking metalworkers created jewelry and weapons with intricate knotwork patterns that seemed to have no beginning or end. These designs required incredible patience to execute, as each line had to flow perfectly into the next. The patterns were more than decoration, they were visual representations of the interconnectedness of all life, reminding the wearer that individual actions ripple outward to affect the entire community. In the deserts of North Africa, Berber peoples developed nomadic lifestyles that moved in harmony with seasonal patterns of rainfall and vegetation. They didn't fight against the harsh environment, but learned to read its subtle signals, knowing exactly when to move their herds to fresh pastures and when to shelter in oases during the worst of the dry season. Their migrations followed routes refined over countless generations, creating a sustainable relationship with one of the world's most challenging environments. Berber artisans created carpets and textiles that told the stories of their people through geometric patterns and symbolic colors. Each piece required months of work, with designs passed down from mothers to daughters through hands-on instruction rather than written patterns. The act of weaving became a form of meditation, connecting the maker to ancestral traditions while creating something beautiful for future generations. Their oral traditions preserve detailed knowledge of desert survival, including the location of water sources, the behavior of sandstorms, and the properties of desert plants that could provide food or medicine. This information was embedded in songs and stories that made it easier to remember, ensuring that vital knowledge wouldn't be lost even if individuals were separated from their groups. Berber hospitality customs required travelers to be welcomed and fed before any questions were asked about their identity or destination. This tradition recognized that the desert was dangerous enough without adding human hostility to its natural challenges. By creating networks of mutual support, desert peoples could survive in conditions that would defeat isolated individuals. Ancient Ethiopian civilizations built remarkable churches carved directly into solid rock, creating spaces for worship that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. These weren't constructed buildings, but sculptures on an architectural scale, requiring years of careful excavation and carving. Workers would start at the surface and gradually work their way down, removing stone to reveal the hidden church within. The process required absolute precision, as mistakes couldn't be corrected once the stone was removed. Ethiopian monasteries preserved ancient texts and traditions through centuries of political upheaval and social change. Monks would spend their entire lives copying manuscripts by hand, understanding that their patient work was preserving knowledge for future generations. They developed techniques for making inks and preparing parchment that would last for centuries, taking pride in creating books that would outlive their makers. The Ethiopian highlands supported agricultural communities that developed terraced farming systems similar to those of the Inca, but adapted to African conditions and crops. These farmers understood that working with steep terrain required patience and cooperation, as terrace construction and maintenance demanded community effort that spanned generations. Ethiopian coffee ceremonies created daily rituals that brought communities together for conversation and connection. The process of roasting, grinding, and brewing coffee was deliberately slow, providing time for neighbors to share news and strengthen social bonds. These ceremonies weren't hurried, but were seen as essential parts of daily life that helped maintain community cohesion. As we wander through these peaceful ancient worlds, we begin to understand that these civilizations shared certain approaches to life that enabled them to create lasting beauty and meaning. They understood that the most important achievements require time to develop, that community cooperation produces better results than individual competition, and that working in harmony with natural systems creates more sustainable outcomes than attempting to dominate or control them. These ancient peoples remind us that there are alternative ways to measure progress and success. Instead of focusing on speed and immediate results, they invested in projects that would benefit their descendants. Instead of consuming resources as quickly as possible, they developed practices that could continue indefinitely. Instead of rushing through daily activities, they found ways to make ordinary tasks into opportunities for mindfulness and connection. Their gentle wisdom for how to live more peace offers us models fully in our own time, suggesting that the solutions to our modern challenges might be found not in new technologies or faster processes, but in remembering older ways of being human that honor both individual needs and collective well-being. In ancient Maya cities hidden beneath the jungle canopy, time moved according to celestial rhythms that governed every aspect of daily life. The Maya developed the most accurate calendar system in the ancient world, not through hurried calculation, but through generations of patient observation. Priest astronomers would spend entire lifetimes tracking the movements of Venus across the night sky, recording each appearance and disappearance in stone monuments that served as permanent reminders of cosmic order. Their pyramids rose from jungle floors like mathematical prayers carved in limestone. Each structure was built according to precise astronomical alignments, with staircases that counted the days of the year and chambers that captured specific moments of sunlight during solstices and equinoxes. The construction of these monuments spanned decades, with each generation adding layers to buildings that would serve their descendants as both temples and calendars. Maya scribes developed the most sophisticated writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas, creating texts that recorded not just historical events, but poetry, prophecy, and scientific observation. Each glyph was a work of art in itself, carefully carved or painted with brushes made from animal hair. The scribes understood that beautiful writing was a form of worship, a way of honoring the gods who had given humanity the gift of language. In their cities, ball courts provided venues for ritual games that combined athletic skill with spiritual meaning. These weren't violent competitions, but ceremonial enactments of cosmic dramas, where players moved a rubber ball to represent the sun's journey across the sky. The games could last for hours, with participants entering trance-like states that connected them to divine forces governing the universe. Maya farmers developed sophisticated agricultural techniques that worked with the challenging environment of tropical rainforests. They created raised fields in swampy areas, using the natural flooding cycles to irrigate their crops. They practiced forest gardening, cultivating useful plants beneath the jungle canopy without clearing the trees that protected the soil, and provided habitat for animals that formed part of their diet. The Maya concept of time was cyclical rather than linear, understanding that events repeated in predictable patterns that could be calculated and prepared for. This perspective encouraged long-term thinking, as people made decisions based on how their actions would affect not just immediate outcomes, but future cycles that might not complete for generations. They planted trees they would never see mature, built roads their great-grandchildren would travel, and preserved knowledge their descendants would need. In the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, Sumerian city-states developed forms of governance that balanced individual leadership with community participation. City councils would meet in temple courtyards to discuss matters affecting the entire population, with decisions emerging through consensus rather than decree. These deliberations could continue for days, as participants understood that rushed decisions often created problems that took years to resolve. Sumerian artisans developed techniques for working with clay that transformed humble earth into objects of lasting beauty. Their pottery was decorated with geometric patterns that reflected mathematical principles underlying cosmic order. Each piece required multiple firings, with potters learning to read the subtle changes in color and texture that indicated when the clay had reached the proper temperature. The process couldn't be hurried, as premature removal from the kiln would cause the piece to crack and crumble. Their system of irrigation transformed desert landscapes into fertile agricultural regions, but only through careful management that considered the needs of all communities sharing the water resources. Canal construction required cooperation between multiple cities, with agreements that specified exactly how much water each settlement could use during different seasons. These negotiations could take years to complete, but the resulting system supported civilization for millennia. Sumerian temples served as centers of economic as well as spiritual life, with priests managing complex systems of trade and resource distribution. They developed the first known forms of banking, keeping detailed records of loans and deposits on clay tablets that preserve financial information for future reference. These transactions weren't conducted hastily, but followed ritual procedures that emphasized the sacred nature of agreements between people. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's earliest literary works, emerged from this Sumerian culture as a meditation on friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning. The story wasn't composed quickly, but evolved over generations, with different versions reflecting the concerns and wisdom of successive communities. Bards would recite the epic during festivals and ceremonies, adapting the narrative to speak to contemporary audiences while preserving its essential truths about the human condition. In the Indus Valley, urban planners created cities that functioned as integrated systems designed for the welfare of all inhabitants. Every house, regardless of size, was connected to the same sophisticated sewage network. Public baths were built at the center of each neighborhood, providing spaces where people from different social levels could gather and maintain community bonds. Granaries were positioned strategically throughout the cities, ensuring that food distribution would remain efficient even during times of crisis. Their standardized weights and measures enabled trade relationships that spanned thousands of miles, with merchants from the Indus Valley establishing trading posts as far away as Central Asia and the Persian Gulf. These commercial networks weren't built through aggressive expansion, but through patient relationship building that created mutual trust between distant communities. Indus Valley traders were welcomed in foreign markets because they had earned reputations for honest dealing and quality craftsmanship. The mysterious Indus Valley script remains undeciphered today, but the careful uniformity of the symbols suggests a literate society that valued precision and clarity in communication. Each character was carved or molded with the same attention to detail that characterized their pottery and metalwork. The consistency of the writing across different cities indicates a shared educational system that maintained common standards over vast distances and long periods of time. Their bronze working techniques produced tools and ornaments that combined functionality with artistic beauty. Each piece required multiple stages of heating, hammering, and polishing, with craftsmen learning through years of apprenticeship how to achieve the perfect balance of hardness and flexibility. The bronze dancers and other figurines discovered in Indus Valley sites display an understanding of human anatomy that could only have come from careful observation and patient practice. Archaeological evidence suggests the Indus Valley civilization declined not through warfare or natural disaster, but through gradual environmental changes that made their agricultural system unsustainable. Rather than fighting these changes or attempting to maintain unsustainable practices, the people appear to have gradually migrated to regions where their traditional way of life could continue. This peaceful adaptation to changing conditions reflects a cultural wisdom that valued long-term survival over short-term resistance to change. Ancient Egyptian temple complexes served as universities where knowledge was preserved and transmitted across generations. Priests spent decades learning to read and write hieroglyphs, to perform religious ceremonies, to calculate astronomical events, and to practice medicine. The education process was gradual and thorough, with students advancing through multiple levels of initiation as they demonstrated mastery of increasingly sophisticated concepts. Egyptian medical papyri reveal a healthcare system that emphasized prevention and gentle treatment over dramatic intervention. Physicians were trained to observe patients carefully, noting subtle changes in appearance, behavior, and vital signs that might indicate developing problems. They used herbs, massage, and dietary adjustments to support the body's natural healing processes. Understanding that recovery often required time and patience rather than aggressive treatment, the Egyptian concept of Ma'at, representing truth, justice, and cosmic order, guided both personal behavior and governmental policy. This wasn't an abstract philosophical principle, but a practical guide for daily decision-making. People were expected to consider how their actions would affect the balance and harmony of their community, understanding that individual choices rippled outward to influence the welfare of society as a whole. Egyptian artists developed techniques for creating wall paintings and sculptures that have retained their beauty and color for thousands of years. They ground their own pigments from minerals and plants, mixing colors according to formulas that had been refined over generations. Each painting required weeks or months to complete, with artists working in teams to cover vast wall surfaces with scenes that told stories and preserved cultural memory. The process of papyrus making transformed river reeds into writing material that enabled the preservation of knowledge across centuries. This wasn't a quick manufacturing process, but a careful sequence of steps that required proper timing and environmental conditions. The reeds had to be harvested at exactly the right stage of growth, then processed through multiple stages of pressing, drying, and finishing that couldn't be rushed without damaging the final product. Egyptian architects designed temples that aligned with celestial events, creating sacred spaces that connected earthly worship with cosmic rhythms. The construction of these monuments required years of planning and decades of construction, with each element positioned according to mathematical principles that reflected divine order. The result was architecture that served not just practical needs but spiritual purposes, reminding visitors of their connection to forces greater than themselves. These ancient civilizations understood that true prosperity came not from accumulating wealth quickly, but from creating sustainable systems that could support human flourishing indefinitely. They invested in infrastructure that would serve multiple generations, developed technologies that worked in harmony with natural systems, and created cultural institutions that preserved wisdom across time. Their patient approach to progress reminds us that the most valuable achievements often require the kind of long-term thinking that our modern world sometimes struggles to maintain. As we continue our gentle journey through these ancient worlds, we discover that the pace of life itself was a form of wisdom, allowing time for reflection, for relationship building, for the gradual development of skills and understanding that created lasting value. Their stories offer us glimpses of alternative ways to organize society, alternative definitions of success, and alternative approaches to the challenges that face every human community across time. In the highlands of ancient Tibet, monasteries perched on impossible mountain ledges became centers of learning that emphasized the gradual cultivation of wisdom over quick acquisition of facts. Monks would spend decades mastering single texts, not through rushed memorization, but through deep contemplation that allowed each teaching to transform their understanding from within. The thin mountain air seemed to naturally slow the pace of life, encouraging a rhythm of existence that honored both the challenges and gifts of high-altitude living. Tibetan artisans created intricate sand mandalas that took weeks to complete, only to be swept away upon finishing as a reminder of life's impermanence. Each grain of colored sand was placed with infinite care, following geometric patterns that represented cosmic order and divine harmony. The artists understood that the process of creation was more important than the permanence of the final product. Finding spiritual meaning in the patient attention required for such delicate work. Their system of trade routes across the Himalayas required travelers to move slowly and deliberately through some of the world's most challenging terrain. Yak caravans would spend months crossing high passes, with traders learning to read weather patterns and seasonal changes that could mean the difference between safe passage and disaster. These journeys weren't undertaken lightly, but required careful preparation and deep respect for the power of mountain environments. Tibetan medicine developed sophisticated diagnostic techniques that required practitioners to spend years learning to detect subtle variations in pulse rhythms that revealed imbalances in the body's energy systems. Treatment often involved gentle adjustments to diet, lifestyle, and mental practices rather than dramatic interventions. Understanding that true healing happened gradually as the whole person returned to harmony with natural rhythms. The practice of sky burial reflected a profound acceptance of death as part of natural cycles, returning bodies to the ecosystem that had sustained life. This wasn't a morbid ritual, but a gentle recognition that human existence was temporary and that the elements that comprised individual bodies would continue in new forms. The ceremony was conducted with reverence and gratitude for the life that had been lived and the continuation that would follow. In ancient Polynesia, navigators developed techniques for reading ocean currents, wind patterns, and star positions that enabled them to cross thousands of miles of open water with remarkable accuracy. These skills weren't learned quickly, but required years of apprenticeship, during which students gradually developed the ability to sense subtle changes in wave patterns that indicated the presence of distant islands. Master navigators could feel the reflection of land and ocean swells long before any visual signs appeared on the horizon. Polynesian canoe builders created vessels that seemed to dance across the waves rather than fighting against them. Each canoe was crafted from trees that had been selected and prepared through lengthy rituals acknowledging the sacrifice of the living wood. The construction process followed traditional methods that had been refined over generations, with builders understanding that shortcuts in preparation would compromise the vessel's performance during long ocean voyages. Their oral traditions preserve detailed genealogies stretching back dozens of generations, maintaining cultural identity across vast distances and long migrations. These weren't simple lists of names, but complex narratives that connected individual families to legendary heroes and divine ancestors. The responsibility for maintaining these traditions was taken seriously, with designated storytellers spending their entire lives perfecting to recite hours of connected narrative without error. Polynesian agricultural techniques transformed volcanic islands into productive food systems through patient development of terraced gardens and sophisticated irrigation networks. They understood that island ecosystems were fragile and that sustainable cultivation required careful attention to soil health and water conservation. The introduction of new crops was done gradually, with communities taking time to understand how different plants would affect existing ecological balances. Their tattoo traditions created body art that told personal stories through geometric patterns and symbolic designs. Each tattoo session was a ritual that could take days to complete, with recipients understanding that the process of receiving these permanent marks was as meaningful as the final result. The designs weren't chosen hastily, but reflected careful consideration of how individual identity connected to cultural values and spiritual beliefs. In the Amazon rainforest, indigenous peoples developed relationships with their forest environment that sustained complex societies for thousands of years without depleting the resources that supported them. They understood the forest not as a collection of individual trees, but as a living system where each species played essential roles in maintaining the health of the whole. Their knowledge of plant medicines required generations to accumulate, with healers spending decades learning to identify and prepare thousands of different species. Amazonian peoples created elaborate festivals that celebrated seasonal changes and honored the spirits they believed inhabited different aspects of the forest. These ceremonies could last for weeks, with participants entering altered states of consciousness that deepened their connection to natural forces governing their world. The festivals weren't simple entertainment, but essential practices that maintained spiritual relationships necessary for community survival. Their agricultural techniques involved creating forest gardens that mimic natural ecosystems, while producing food for human communities. They would plant dozens of different species in carefully planned arrangements that supported each other's growth while providing diverse harvests throughout the year. This approach required intimate knowledge of how different plants interacted and deep understanding of forest ecology that could only develop through patient observation across generations. Amazonian craft traditions produced textiles, pottery, and tools that reflected both practical needs and spiritual beliefs. Each item required extensive preparation time, from gathering raw materials according to lunar cycles to processing fibers and clays through traditional methods that couldn't be rushed. The resulting objects were both functional and beautiful, embodying cultural values that emphasized harmony between human creativity and natural processes. Their systems of river navigation enabled trade and communication across thousands of miles of waterways, but required detailed knowledge of seasonal flooding patterns, dangerous rapids, and the locations of resources needed for long journeys. This information was embedded in songs and stories that made navigation knowledge easier to remember and transmit to younger generations, learning to travel safely through complex river systems. In ancient Australia, Aboriginal peoples developed Dreamtime traditions that connected every landscape feature to ancestral stories and spiritual teachings. These weren't simple myths, but complex knowledge systems that preserved information about water sources, seasonal changes, animal behavior, and survival techniques necessary for life in challenging environments. The stories were performed through ceremonies that could last for days, with participants gradually learning the deeper meanings embedded within familiar narratives. Aboriginal art traditions created paintings on rock surfaces that served as both artistic expression and practical communication, marking important locations and preserving cultural knowledge for future generations. The painting process was ritualized, with artists following traditional methods for preparing pigments from natural materials and applying them according to symbolic systems that had been maintained for thousands of years. Their hunting and gathering practices were sustainable because they were based on detailed understanding of animal life cycles and plant reproduction patterns. Aboriginal peoples would move through their territories according to seasonal schedules that allowed different areas to recover from human use while providing continuous resources for community needs. This required remarkable restraint and long-term thinking that prioritized ecological health over immediate consumption. Aboriginal tool-making traditions produced implements that were perfectly adapted to specific environments and uses. Each tool required considerable time to create, from selecting appropriate materials to shaping and finishing according to techniques that had been refined through countless generations of use. The resulting tools were often multifunctional, reflecting deep understanding of how to maximize utility while minimizing resource consumption. Their kinship systems created social networks that extended across vast distances, enabling cooperation and resource sharing between groups that might not encounter each other for years at a time. These relationships weren't casual connections, but formal obligations that required individuals to understand their responsibilities to distant relatives and their roles in maintaining social harmony across entire regions. In ancient Scandinavia, the long winter months created natural rhythms of life that emphasized indoor crafts, storytelling, and community gathering during the dark season. People would spend these quiet months repairing tools, creating beautiful objects, and sharing the stories that preserved cultural wisdom and family history. The forced slowness of winter became an opportunity for activities that required patience and sustained attention. Norse woodworking traditions produced carved objects that transformed functional items into works of art. Ship prows, house posts, and everyday utensils were decorated with intricate patterns that reflected both aesthetic sensibilities and spiritual beliefs. Each carving required weeks of careful work, with artisans understanding that the time invested in beautifying ordinary objects enriched daily life for everyone who encountered them. Their farming practices were adapted to short growing seasons that required careful timing and efficient use of every available day. Norse farmers developed techniques for preserving food through long winters, understanding that survival depended on patient preparation during abundant seasons. They bred animals and selected crop varieties that could thrive in challenging northern conditions, creating sustainable agricultural systems that supported communities for generations. Norse metalworking produced weapons and jewelry that combined functional excellence with artistic beauty. Swordsmiths would spend months forging a single blade, folding and refolding the metal to create patterns that were both decorative and structural. The resulting weapons were treasured not just for their effectiveness, but as works of art that could be passed down through families as heirlooms connecting generations. Their exploration traditions led to the discovery and settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America, but these ventures were undertaken with careful preparation and realistic understanding of the challenges involved. Norse explorers would spend years planning expeditions, gathering information from previous travelers, and preparing ships and supplies for journeys into unknown territories. They understood that successful exploration required patience, preparation, and respect for the dangerous forces they would encounter. As we drift through these ancient worlds, we begin to see patterns emerging across cultures and continents. Despite vast differences in environment, technology, and social organization, these civilizations shared certain approaches to life that enabled them to create lasting achievements and maintain stable communities across generations. They understood that the most valuable things require time to develop properly, that individual success depends on community cooperation, and that sustainable prosperity comes from working with natural systems rather than against them. Their gentle wisdom offers us models for living that emphasize patience over speed, quality over quantity, and harmony over domination. In our modern world of instant communication and rapid change, these ancient voices remind us that there are alternative ways to measure progress and success, alternative rhythms of life that might offer more satisfaction and sustainability than our current approaches to human development and social organization. These peaceful civilizations created beauty that has survived for millennia, developed knowledge that continues to inform modern understanding, and established patterns of community life that sustained human flourishing across vast spans of time. Their stories suggest that the solutions to our contemporary challenges might be found not in new technologies or faster processes, but in remembering older ways of being human that honored both individual potential and collective welfare. In the vast steppes of Central Asia, nomadic peoples developed a profound understanding of seasonal migration that allowed them to thrive in environments where settled agriculture would have been impossible. The Mongols and other nomadic groups didn't fight against the harsh winters and scorching summers of the grasslands. Instead, they learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when it was time to move their herds to fresh pastures. They understood that the land itself would tell them where to go and when to travel, if they were patient enough to listen. Their felt-making traditions transformed sheep's wool into portable homes that could withstand the fierce winds and temperature extremes of the steppes. The process of creating felt required days of careful work, with entire families participating in the rhythmic pressing and rolling that gradually transformed loose fibers into dense, waterproof material. Each yurt was a masterpiece of engineering that could be assembled or disassembled in less than an hour, yet provided comfortable shelter that lasted for decades. Mongol horsemanship wasn't just a practical skill, but a spiritual partnership between human and animal that began in early childhood. Children would spend years learning to communicate with horses through subtle shifts in weight and breathing, developing relationships that allowed them to move across the steppes as if they were part of a single organism. These weren't lessons that could be rushed or forced, but required the gradual development of trust and understanding that deepened over time. Their oral traditions preserve detailed knowledge of genealogies, territorial boundaries, and seasonal patterns that enabled nomadic communities to coordinate their movements across vast distances without conflict. Master storytellers could recite for hours without repetition, weaving together historical events, moral teachings, and practical information in narratives that entertained while they educated. These stories weren't just entertainment, but essential knowledge systems that maintained social order and cultural identity across generations. Mongol metalworking produced beautiful objects from the iron and silver they acquired through trade with settled peoples. Their craftsmen would spend the winter months creating jewelry, weapons, and horse fittings that combined functionality with artistic expression. Each piece reflected not only technical skill, but deep understanding of the aesthetic principles that made objects both beautiful and meaningful to nomadic peoples who carried everything they owned. In the Highlands of ancient Scotland, Celtic clans developed social systems that balanced individual honor with collective responsibility. Their clan structure wasn't based on rigid hierarchy, but on networks of mutual obligation that ensured everyone's needs were met during difficult times. When one family faced hardship, others would provide support without expecting immediate repayment, understanding that survival in harsh mountain environments required community cooperation that transcended individual interests. Scottish crafters created tartans with patterns that identified clan membership while reflecting the colors of their local landscapes. Each design required months of planning and weaving, with skilled artisans developing dye formulas that would produce lasting colors from local plants and minerals. The resulting textiles weren't just clothing, but visual representations of cultural identity that connected individuals to ancestral traditions and territorial heritage. Their castle-building traditions produced fortifications that seemed to grow naturally from rocky hillsides and cliff faces. Scottish builders understood that defensive structures needed to work with the landscape, rather than imposing foreign architectural concepts on challenging terrain. Construction could take decades, with each generation adding improvements while maintaining the overall design principles that made the castles both beautiful and functional. Highland farming communities developed agricultural techniques adapted to short growing seasons and unpredictable weather patterns. They planted multiple varieties of crops to ensure that some would survive regardless of seasonal variations, and they developed sophisticated methods for preserving food through long winters. These practices required detailed knowledge of local conditions that could only be accumulated through patient observation across many seasons. Scottish musical traditions created complex compositions that preserved clan histories and emotional connections to ancestral lands. Pipers and harpists would spend years mastering instruments that could express the full range of human emotion, from the joy of celebration to the sorrow of loss. Their music wasn't just entertainment, but a form of cultural memory that kept alive the stories and values that defined Highland identity. In ancient Wales, bardic traditions elevated storytelling to an art form that required decades to master. Welsh bards underwent rigorous training that began in childhood and continued throughout their lives, learning to memorize hundreds of stories, poems, and historical accounts. They understood that cultural knowledge was too precious to risk losing through careless transmission, so they developed techniques for preserving information that could survive even when written records were destroyed. Welsh poetry followed complex metrical patterns that required poets to demonstrate mastery of language at multiple levels simultaneously. Creating a single poem could take months as poets worked to achieve perfect balance between sound, meaning, and emotional impact. These weren't casual verses, but carefully crafted works of art that could move listeners to tears or inspire them to heroic action. Their mining traditions developed techniques for extracting metals from mountain veins that honored both practical needs and spiritual beliefs about the living earth. Welsh miners understood that removing minerals was a form of negotiation with powerful forces that required appropriate rituals and careful attention. two signs that indicated when it was safe to proceed. They developed methods that minimized environmental damage while producing the metals needed for tools systems that worked with the challenging terrain of and trade. Welsh agricultural communities created field mountainous regions. They built stone walls that lasted for centuries, defining boundaries and providing shelter for crops and animals. These walls weren't erected hastily, but constructed according to traditional methods that ensured they would remain stable through countless seasons of freeze and thaw. Their weaving traditions produced textiles with patterns that reflected the mathematical principles underlying Celtic artistic expression. Welsh weavers would spend months creating single pieces, working with wool from sheep that grazed on mountain pastures rich with plants that provided natural dyes. Each textile was unique, reflecting not only the weaver's skill, but the specific conditions of the season and location where it was created. In ancient Ireland, monastic communities preserved classical knowledge through the Dark Ages by copying manuscripts with infinite patience and care. Irish monks understood that they were maintaining the intellectual heritage of Western civilization during a time when libraries were being destroyed and schools were closing across Europe. They worked by candlelight through long winter nights, carefully reproducing texts that might otherwise have been lost forever. Their illuminated manuscripts combined practical preservation of knowledge with artistic expression that transformed books into sacred objects. Each page required days or weeks to complete, with scribes creating intricate decorations that reflected both Christian symbolism and older Celtic artistic traditions. The resulting books weren't just repositories of information, but works of art that honored the knowledge they contained. Irish metalworkers created religious objects and personal ornaments that displayed technical skill rivaling anything produced in more cosmopolitan centers. Their brooches, chalices, and crosses required months of careful work, combining multiple metals and techniques to create objects that serve both practical and spiritual purposes. Each piece reflected not only individual artistry, but cultural values that emphasized beauty as a form of worship. Their storytelling traditions preserved pre-Christian mythology alongside Christian teachings, creating a unique synthesis that honored both ancient wisdom and new religious insights. Irish storytellers could recite for entire nights without repetition, drawing listeners into worlds where heroic figures faced challenges that tested their courage, wisdom, and moral character. Irish agricultural communities developed farming techniques adapted to the wet climate and acidic soils of their island environment. They created field systems that provided drainage while conserved inappropriate methods. Their practices supported communities for generations. Without that, sustainable agriculture required working in nutrients, understanding rather than trying to impose, depleting the resources with natural conditions that sustained them. In the mountains of ancient Armenia, communities developed architectural traditions that created churches and monasteries seemingly carved from the living rock itself. Armenian builders understood that mountain construction required techniques that could withstand earthquakes and extreme weather conditions. They developed methods for cutting and fitting stones that created structures of remarkable stability and beauty that have survived for over 1,000 years. Armenian manuscript illumination created books that combined scholarly preservation of knowledge with artistic achievement of the highest caliber. Their scribes worked in monastery scriptoriums that provided ideal conditions for the patient work of copying and decorating texts. Each manuscript required years to complete, with teams of specialists contributing different skills to create books that served both educational and devotional purposes. Their carpet-weaving traditions produced textiles that told stories through symbolic patterns and colors that connected earthly beauty to spiritual meanings. Armenian weavers would spend months or years creating single carpets, understanding that the process of creation was itself a form of meditation that deepened their connection to ancestral traditions and divine inspiration. Armenian communities maintained trade networks that connected Europe with Asia, facilitating cultural exchange that enriched all the civilizations they touched. Their merchants were welcomed in distant markets because they had earned reputations for honest dealing and quality products. These commercial relationships weren't built quickly but developed through generations of patient relationship building that created trust across vast cultural differences. Their agricultural techniques transformed mountain slopes into productive terraces that could support dense populations while maintaining soil health across centuries of continuous cultivation. Armenian farmers understood that mountain agriculture required careful attention to water management and soil conservation. They developed irrigation systems that captured snowmelt and distributed it efficiently across terraced fields that stepped gracefully down steep hillsides. As we continue our gentle journey through these ancient worlds, we discover that wisdom traditions across cultures shared certain fundamental insights about how to create lasting beauty and meaning. These civilizations understood that the most valuable achievements required patience, that individual excellence emerged from community support, and that sustainable prosperity came from working in harmony with natural systems, rather than attempting to dominate or control them. Their approaches to time itself offer us alternative models for thinking about progress and success. Instead of measuring achievement by speed of accomplishment, they evaluated projects by their potential to benefit future generations. Instead of rushing through daily activities, they found ways to make ordinary tasks into opportunities for skill development, social connection, and spiritual growth. These ancient voices remind us that there are different ways to be human, different rhythms of life that might offer more satisfaction than our contemporary emphasis on constant acceleration and immediate results. Their gentle wisdom suggests that the solutions to our modern challenges might be found not in new technologies or faster processes, but in remembering older patterns of living that honored both individual potential and collective well-being. The peaceful achievements of these civilizations continue to inspire us today, offering glimpses of what becomes possible when communities commit to long-term thinking, sustainable practices, and the patient cultivation of beauty in all aspects of daily life. Their stories suggest that true prosperity emerges not from accumulating resources quickly, but from creating systems that can support human flourishing across generations, leaving legacies that enrich the world long after their creators have passed into memory. In the deserts of ancient Persia, Zoroastrian fire temples maintained sacred flames that burned continuously for centuries, tended by priests who understood that some responsibilities transcended individual lifetimes. These weren't simple religious rituals, but profound commitments to maintaining connections between earthly communities and divine forces that required dedication spanning multiple generations. The priests who tended these flames spent their entire lives learning the prayers, ceremonies, and practical skills needed to keep the sacred fires burning regardless of political upheaval or natural disasters. Persian gardens represented earthly versions of paradise, designed according to mathematical principles that reflected cosmic harmony and divine perfection. Garden makers would spend decades planning and planting these spaces, understanding that the most beautiful results required time for trees to mature and water systems to establish their proper flow. Each garden was unique, adapted to its specific location and climate, yet all followed design principles that created spaces of profound tranquility and beauty. Their road systems connected diverse regions of their empire not through military force but through infrastructure that facilitated trade, communication, and cultural exchange. Persian engineers understood that lasting empires were built on networks of mutual benefit rather than conquest and exploitation. They created highways that could be used safely by merchants, scholars, and ordinary travelers, establishing rest stations and supply depots that made long-distance journeys practical for civilian purposes. Persian textile production created fabrics that combined technical innovation with artistic achievement of remarkable sophistication. Their weavers developed techniques for creating complex patterns that seemed to shimmer with inner light, using silk threads dyed with formulas that produced colors of extraordinary richness and durability. Each carpet or wall hanging required months of careful work, with master weavers training apprentices through years of patient instruction that transmitted both technical skills and aesthetic sensibilities. Zoroastrian ethical teachings emphasized the importance of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds in creating a world where light gradually overcomes darkness. This wasn't passive philosophy, but active commitment to daily choices that would contribute to the cosmic struggle between constructive and destructive forces. Followers understood that individual actions, however small, participated in universal processes that determined the ultimate fate of creation itself. In ancient Nubia, along the upper reaches of the Nile River, kingdoms developed that combined Egyptian influences with distinctly African traditions to create unique cultural syntheses. Nubian pyramid builders created monuments that honored their rulers while reflecting architectural principles adapted to local conditions and materials. These pyramids were smaller than their Egyptian counterparts but displayed engineering skills and artistic sensibilities that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both practical and symbolic requirements. Nubian metalworkers became renowned throughout the ancient world for their skill in working with iron and gold, creating objects that combined functional excellence with beauty that reflected their distinctive aesthetic traditions. Their techniques for smelting and forging metals were closely guarded secrets passed down through family lines, with master craftsmen spending decades perfecting skills that enabled them to create weapons and ornaments of legendary quality. Their trade networks extended from the Mediterranean to the interior of Africa, facilitating exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices that enriched all the communities they connected. Nubian merchants were respected throughout the ancient world for their knowledge of distant markets and their ability to negotiate fair agreements that created lasting commercial relationships, rather than simple one-time transactions. Nubian women held positions of significant authority in their society, with several female rulers governing kingdoms and leading military campaigns. This wasn't casual equality, but systematic recognition that effective leadership required the best talents regardless of gender, and that sustainable governance needed perspectives from all segments of society. Their agricultural techniques adapted Egyptian farming methods to the different conditions of the Upper Nile Valley, creating systems that could support dense populations while maintaining soil fertility across generations of continuous cultivation. Nubian farmers understood that successful agriculture in their environment required careful attention to seasonal flooding patterns and soil management practices that preserved the land's productive capacity. In ancient Ethiopia, highland kingdoms developed architectural traditions that created churches carved directly from solid volcanic rock, producing sacred spaces that seem to emerge from the earth itself rather than being imposed upon it. Ethiopian builders understood that such construction required techniques completely different from conventional building methods, developing skills for excavation and carving that created structures of remarkable stability and beauty. Ethiopian manuscript traditions preserved Christian texts and indigenous knowledge through centuries of political instability, with monastic communities maintaining libraries and scriptoriums that continued functioning regardless of external conflicts. Their scribes developed distinctive artistic styles for illuminating manuscripts that combined Christian symbolism with traditional Ethiopian design elements, creating books that served both religious and cultural purposes. Their coffee cultivation practices transformed wild plants into agricultural crops that would eventually spread throughout the world. But they did so with careful attention to maintaining the ecological relationships that supported sustainable production. Ethiopian farmers understood that coffee required specific growing conditions and developed techniques for cultivating it within forest environments that preserved the biodiversity necessary for long-term agricultural success. Ethiopian church music developed unique modal systems and rhythmic patterns that created sacred soundscapes, unlike anything found elsewhere in the Christian world. Their musicians spent years learning to perform complex compositions that combined individual skill with group coordination, creating ceremonies that engaged participants in profound spiritual experiences through carefully orchestrated combinations of music, movement, and prayer. Their traditional medicine systems integrated physical treatments with spiritual practices, understanding that healing required attention to the whole person rather than just specific symptoms. Ethiopian healers spent decades learning to diagnose conditions through careful observation of subtle signs and to prepare treatments using plants and minerals whose properties had been discovered through generations of patient experimentation and careful record-keeping. In the mountains of ancient Georgia, communities developed winemaking traditions that transformed grape cultivation into an art form, requiring generations to perfect. Georgian vintners understood that exceptional wines couldn't be produced quickly, but required patient attention to every aspect of the process, from vineyard management to fermentation techniques. They developed methods for aging wines in clay vessels buried underground, creating conditions that produced flavors of remarkable complexity and character. Georgian polyphonic singing traditions created music that seemed to capture the essence of their mountain landscape in sound, with multiple vocal lines weaving together in harmonies that required years of practice to master. Their singers understood that this music couldn't be learned from written notation, but required direct transmission from experienced performers who could teach the subtle variations in pitch and rhythm that made each song unique. Their architectural traditions produced churches and secular buildings that seemed to grow naturally from rocky mountainsides, using local stone and traditional construction techniques that created structures perfectly adapted to seismic conditions and extreme weather. Georgian builders developed methods for cutting and fitting stones that created walls of remarkable stability without the use of mortar. Understanding that mountain construction required techniques that could flex with earth movement while maintaining structural integrity. Georgian metalworking traditions produced religious objects and personal ornaments that displayed technical skill, rivaling the best work produced anywhere in the medieval world. Their craftsmen developed techniques for working with gold, silver, and precious stones that created objects of extraordinary beauty and spiritual significance. Understanding that sacred art required the highest levels of technical achievement, combined with deep spiritual devotion. Their manuscript illumination traditions created books that preserved both religious texts and secular knowledge through turbulent historical periods, with monastic scriptoriums maintaining libraries that served as centers of learning for entire regions. Georgian scribes developed distinctive calligraphic styles and decorative techniques that made their manuscripts instantly recognizable while serving the practical purpose of preserving knowledge for future generations. As we drift deeper into these ancient worlds, we continue to discover civilizations that understood how to create lasting beauty and meaning through patient attention to detail and commitment to values that transcended immediate practical concerns. These cultures remind us that human achievement reaches its highest expression not through speed or efficiency, but through the careful cultivation of skills, relationships, and understanding that develop gradually over time. Their approaches to education, governance, agriculture, and artistic expression offer us models for living that emphasize quality over quantity, sustainability over short-term gain, and community welfare over individual advancement. In our contemporary world of rapid change and instant communication, these ancient voices suggest alternative ways of measuring progress and success that might offer more satisfaction and meaning than our current emphasis on constant acceleration and immediate results. The gentle wisdom of these civilizations continues to speak across the centuries, reminding us that the most valuable things in life, love, beauty, wisdom, and community cannot be rushed, but must be cultivated with the same patience a gardener brings to tending growing things. Their peaceful achievements suggest that true prosperity emerges not from conquering or consuming, but from learning to live in harmony with the natural and social systems that sustain all life on Earth. In the volcanic islands of ancient Iceland, Norse settlers developed a unique form of democracy that gathered representatives from across the island at a single outdoor assembly that could last for weeks. The Althing met each summer at Thingvellir, where the continental plates pull apart and create a natural amphitheater in the landscape itself. Here, in this dramatic setting between Europe and America, people would travel for days across lava fields and glacial rivers to participate in discussions that shaped their entire society. The Icelandic approach to law wasn't based on written codes imposed by distant rulers, but on collective memory maintained by specially trained individuals who could recite the entire legal tradition from memory. These law speakers would stand before the assembly and recite different sections of their legal heritage, ensuring that everyone understood the principles that governed their community. The process couldn't be hurried, as each case required careful consideration of precedent and community impact. Their saga tradition created some of the world's greatest literature through oral storytelling that was eventually written down with meticulous care. These weren't simple adventure stories, but complex psychological portraits that explored how individuals responded to the challenges of life in a harsh but beautiful land. The sagas revealed deep understanding of human nature, showing how personal choices created consequences that ripple through families and communities across generations. Icelandic farmers developed techniques for surviving in a land where the growing season was short and unpredictable. They learned to preserve food through fermentation and drying methods that could sustain families through long winters when fresh provisions were impossible to obtain. Their livestock were hardy breeds that could survive outdoors year-round, grazing on whatever vegetation they could find beneath the snow. Their geothermal knowledge enabled them to harness the Earth's internal heat for practical purposes, creating hot springs for bathing and warming that made life comfortable even in the depths of winter. They understood that their volcanic island provided unique resources that required different approaches from those used in more temperate climates, developing techniques that worked with geological forces rather than fighting against them. In ancient Korea, mountain monasteries became centers of learning where Buddhist teachings merged with indigenous spiritual traditions to create unique forms of meditation and artistic expression. Korean monks developed printing techniques that produced some of the world's earliest books, understanding that preserving knowledge required methods that could create multiple copies without the errors that crept into hand-copied manuscripts. Their wooden printing blocks were carved with such precision that texts produced from them remained clear and readable for centuries. Korean pottery traditions created ceramics that achieved a perfect balance between functionality and beauty, with glazes that seemed to capture the subtle colors of their mountain and forest landscapes. Master potters spent decades learning to control fire and clay in ways that produced vessels of extraordinary elegance, understanding that the finest ceramics required not just technical skill, but deep appreciation for the materials themselves. Their architectural traditions produced temples and palaces that seemed to float lightly on their foundations, using wooden construction techniques that allowed buildings to flex with earthquakes and seasonal temperature changes. Korean builders understood that permanent structures in their seismically active landscape required flexibility rather than rigid strength, developing joinery methods that created buildings of remarkable durability and grace. Korean agricultural communities developed rice cultivation techniques that transformed mountain valleys into terraced landscapes of extraordinary beauty and productivity. Their farmers understood that successful rice growing required precise control of water levels and timing, creating irrigation systems that could be adjusted throughout the growing season to provide exactly the conditions each crop stage required. Their musical traditions created instruments and compositions that seemed to echo the sounds of wind through mountain forests and water flowing over stone. Korean musicians spent years learning to play instruments like the gyeogyum, a stringed instrument that required subtle finger techniques to produce its characteristic ethereal tones. The music wasn't just entertainment, but a form of meditation that connected performers and listeners to natural rhythms underlying all existence. In ancient Vietnam, river delta communities developed floating agricultural systems that worked in harmony with seasonal flooding patterns that could vary dramatically from year to year. Vietnamese farmers understood that fighting against the water was futile, so they developed techniques that used flood cycles to their advantage, creating fields that could produce crops during dry seasons and transform into fish ponds when the rivers rose. Their lacquerware traditions created objects of stunning beauty and durability through processes that required months of patient work. Vietnamese artisans would apply dozens of thin layers of tree sap, polishing each coat to perfect smoothness before adding the next. The resulting surfaces seemed to glow with inner light, creating objects that served both practical and ceremonial purposes, while demonstrating the extraordinary results possible through patient craftsmanship. Vietnamese silk weaving produced textiles that combined technical sophistication with artistic achievement of the highest caliber. Their weavers developed techniques for creating complex patterns that seemed to shift and change as light moved across the fabric, using silk threads so fine they seemed like captured moonbeams. Each piece required months of careful work, with weavers understanding that the most beautiful results couldn't be rushed. Their architecture adapted Chinese building principles to tropical conditions, creating structures that provided comfort and protection while remaining open to cooling breezes and natural light. Vietnamese builders understood that their climate required different approaches from those used in northern countries, developing techniques for ventilation and moisture control that created buildings perfectly suited to their environment. Vietnamese literature developed poetic forms that captured the essence of their landscape and culture in verses that could be memorized and passed down through generations. Their poets understood that the most powerful writing emerged from careful observation of daily life and deep appreciation for the natural world, creating works that continued to speak to readers across centuries of social and political change. In the islands of ancient Indonesia, spice traders developed networks that connected remote growing regions with markets thousands of miles away, but they did so through patient relationship building rather than aggressive expansion. Indonesian merchants understood that sustainable trade required trust and mutual benefit, taking time to learn local customs and languages wherever they traveled. Their success came not from quick profits, but from creating lasting partnerships that enriched all the communities they connected. Indonesian textile traditions produced batik fabrics that transformed simple cotton into works of art through dyeing processes that could take weeks to complete. Each piece of batik was unique, with patterns created through wax-resist techniques that required extraordinary skill and patience. The designs weren't just decorative, but carried symbolic meanings that connected wearers to cultural traditions and spiritual beliefs. Their rice terrace systems transformed steep mountainsides into agricultural landscapes of breathtaking beauty and remarkable productivity. Indonesian farmers developed irrigation techniques that distributed water across hundreds of terraced fields, creating systems that required community cooperation to maintain but could support dense populations for centuries without depleting soil fertility. Indonesian gamelan music created orchestral compositions that seemed to capture the essence of their tropical islands in sound, with bronze instruments that produced tones of extraordinary richness and complexity. Musicians spent years learning to perform as part of ensembles that required precise coordination between dozens of different instruments, creating music that engaged listeners in profound aesthetic experiences. Their wood carving traditions produced architectural decorations and ritual objects that transformed ordinary materials into expressions of spiritual and artistic achievement. Indonesian carvers understood that their tropical hardwoods required different techniques from those used with softer northern woods, developing skills that could reveal the natural beauty hidden within each piece of timber. In ancient Cambodia, the builders of Angkor Wat created a temple complex that represented the cosmos in stone, with every dimension and decoration calculated according to mathematical principles that reflected divine order. Khmer architects understood that such a project required not just engineering skill, but deep spiritual understanding, spending years planning each element to ensure that the finished temple would serve both practical and symbolic purposes. Their hydraulic engineering created water management systems that could control flooding and irrigation across vast areas of rice fields, supporting populations that numbered in the millions. Cambodian engineers developed techniques for moving and controlling water that enabled their civilization to thrive in a region where seasonal variations in rainfall could mean the difference between abundance and famine. Khmer sculptors created stone carvings that seemed to bring mythological figures to life, with thousands of individual figures that each required months of careful work to complete. Their artists understood that temple decoration wasn't just ornamental, but served educational and spiritual purposes, creating visual narratives that could communicate complex religious teachings to people regardless of their literacy level. Their dance traditions created performances that combined physical skill with spiritual expression, telling stories through movements that required years of training to master. Cambodian dancers understood that their art form preserved cultural knowledge while creating beauty that could transport audiences into realms of transcendent experience. Cambodian textile production created silk fabrics that rivaled anything produced elsewhere in the ancient world, with weaving techniques that created patterns of extraordinary intricacy and beauty. Their weavers developed methods for dyeing threads that produced colors of remarkable intensity and durability, understanding that the finest textiles required attention to every detail of the production process. As our journey through these peaceful ancient worlds draws toward its end, we find ourselves surrounded by the gentle wisdom of civilizations that understood how to create lasting beauty through patient attention to detail and commitment to values that transcended immediate practical concerns. These cultures remind us that human achievement reaches its highest expression not through speed or efficiency, but through the careful cultivation of skills, relationships, and understanding that develop gradually over time. Their stories offer us glimpses of alternative ways to organize society, alternative approaches to education and governance, and alternative definitions of progress that emphasized sustainability over growth, quality over quantity, and community welfare over individual advancement. In our contemporary world of constant acceleration and instant communication, these ancient voices suggest that the solutions to our modern challenges might be found not in new technologies, but in remembering older patterns of living that honored both individual potential and collective well-being. The peaceful achievements of these civilizations continue to inspire us today, their architectural monuments still standing after thousands of years, their artistic traditions still influencing contemporary creators, their philosophical insights still offering guidance for those seeking meaning and purpose in life. Their gentle approaches to the challenges that face every human community remind us that there are ways of being human that emphasize cooperation over competition, patience over haste, and harmony over domination. These ancient peoples understood something we often forget in our hurried modern world, that the most meaningful achievements require time to develop properly, that the strongest foundations are built slowly and carefully, and that true prosperity emerges not from consuming resources quickly, but from creating systems that can support human flourishing across generations. Their wisdom whispers to us across the centuries, suggesting that perhaps the path forward lies not in abandoning the past, but in learning from those who came before us, who faced similar challenges with grace, patience, and the quiet confidence that comes from understanding our place in the larger rhythms of existence. Their gentle wisdom continues to echo in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, reminding us that there is profound beauty in the unhurried rhythms they chose to follow. These ancient peoples knew something about time itself that we have perhaps forgotten, understanding that the most precious things in life cannot be rushed or forced, but must be allowed to unfold according to their own natural pace. In the mountain villages of ancient Bhutan, communities developed a concept of happiness that wasn't measured by material accumulation, but by the quality of relationships and spiritual contentment. Bhutanese people understood that true prosperity came from living in harmony with their dramatic mountain environment, taking only what they needed from forests that stretched up toward snow-capped peaks. Their festivals celebrated the changing seasons with dances that could last for days, with participants understanding that joy shared slowly was more nourishing than pleasure consumed quickly. Their architectural traditions created monasteries that seemed to cling impossibly to cliff faces, built by craftsmen who spent years learning how to work with stone and wood in ways that honored both structural needs and spiritual purposes. Each monastery was positioned to take advantage of natural features that enhanced meditation, with prayer halls oriented to capture specific qualities of light during different times of day. The construction process followed rhythms dictated by weather and seasons, with builders understanding that mountain construction required patience and flexibility that couldn't be hurried. Bhutanese textile traditions produced fabrics that told stories through patterns passed down through maternal lines, with mothers teaching daughters weaving techniques that required years to master completely. Each piece reflected not only technical skill, but cultural knowledge about plant dyes that could be gathered from high alpine meadows and processed according to methods refined across generations. The weaving process itself became a form of meditation, connecting the maker to ancestral traditions while creating something useful and beautiful for daily life. Their approach to education emphasized gradual development of the accumulation of facts, with wisdom rather than rappy young people spending years learning traditional skills alongside academic subjects. Bhutanese teachers understood that real learning happens slowly through patient practice and careful observation of experienced practitioners who could demonstrate not just techniques but the deeper principles underlying all skillful action. And so our gentle journey through time draws to a close, leaving us wrapped in the quiet wisdom of these ancient voices. These civilizations remind us that true beauty emerges not from haste, but from the patient cultivation of what matters most. Their peaceful rhythms still echo in the spaces between heartbeats, whispering that perhaps the most profound way forward is to remember how to slow down, to listen, and to build with the same loving patience they brought to every stone they placed and every tradition they preserved. Sleep well, and may their gentle wisdom carry you peacefully through the night.